Okay, everybody, welcome back. Here we are, Unit 6, Week 6, looking at the Church's teachings regarding wealth and poverty. I'll deal with riches first. Of note, this week I decided to collect together the references that are scattered across several documents, and I scanned them and turned them to text and tried to clean up some of the scans. There might be one or two blips, but I think I just have been kind of rushed this week juggling things. So you have, for the reading, one single document. It's a PDF about 30 pages long, just collecting together lots of the quotes. And what we're going to deal with here, a little outline, right? Look at the principles that Christ presents to us concerning poverty, concerning wealth. And what the Christian vision, of course, looks at is as our primary source of knowing, right, in our heart of hearts, that God is the creator, who actually said to the first man and woman, right? He said in Genesis 1:28, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the air and all living creatures. And God gives man the right to occupy the earth, to till the earth, to enjoy its fruits, to make animals serve particular uses. So this is, of course, our dominion over material goods. It's a means of our conserving our life and promoting our life. But, of course, material goods are not the only thing that satisfy our needs. They should satisfy, as we see, legitimate needs of life. They serve, of course, to satisfy a variety of desires that also provide us with comforts and pleasures. And that's, of course, one reason why material goods can become subjected to some abuse. So I'll flesh that out in the notion of the doctrine. We'll get into riches in the pagan world a bit, examine how Christ taught about wealth in light of that pagan environment that he was teaching in. Then we'll look at the church teachings. We'll also then dive into the notion of poverty, especially in the pagan world. You'll see how it was treated, and what Christ does is provide the poor with dignity. And we'll see the church's attitude and position towards the poor. So we have, of course, the doctrine on material goods, that all of the material world around us is subject to man, that it is under the dominion of man. In Psalm 8, verses 7 and 9, you hear, thou hast set him over the works of your hands, O God. Thou hast subjected all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and the beasts also of the fields, the birds of the air and the fishes of the sea, that pass through the paths of the sea. And of course, we have a right to possess and to enjoy those goods necessary for our lives. This is something we covered a bit in private property, but now fleshed out more. Especially, we have the right to life, and carries with it the right of possession of material goods. And wealth, of course, is a condition that is possessed by a person who has abundant means, sufficient for life. And the church's notion of the doctrine of wealth is that this is, say, means that go beyond what is necessary for one to have the sufficient life. We also mean, of course, that wealth possessed by persons refers to goods that are also productive of wealth. So we want to look at wealth in light of Christianity, and so thus we'll look at the teachings of Christ and the church concerning, now here, the use of wealth and its distribution. Now that's a little bit different from an analysis of what causes the surplus to arise, and of course it's a little bit different as well from what would cause the surplus to grow. But now we're interested in how we would allocate and use the wealth, which have, of course, intensely moral elements. And so we want to consider really what the teaching of Christ would have in light of how wealth was considered and regarded and used in the pagan world. And here by wealth I mean, remember, the goods themselves that produce wealth, and a condition of mankind whereby a surplus beyond what is sufficient for life has derived from their productive actions. Now, before Christ, in the pagan world, the wealthy man, of course, could use and misuse goods and really had no limitations. They had a variety of cultural values that hinged upon the recognition of possession of, say, sacred duty to work um, in what would be called sanctioned areas of life. But even in the midst of, say, starvation of peoples, the right the poor were fragile, and right the wealthy one could ignore the pleas of the poor, could ignore those who were needy. And in fact, the poor who were needy were, you know, kept off of the radar screen of the wealthy as much as possible, thus leading to neglect. Right? In pagan philosophy and religion, didn't impose specific, particular tenets on the rich towards the poor. You saw, for instance, that there was the story of the master at the table gorging himself while Lazarus was starving at the door. This is a typology of the rich man in pagan times. And in a sense, what would happen is that, right, the greater the riches, the greater was the reveling. That was sort of the typical element of the day. But those who had nothing, right, those who had nothing were passed over. So in those days, right, you had a fairly immensely wealthy few persons. They lived in luxury. And they'd have, of course, crowds of poor around them. The writers of these times often speak of the riches of the Roman patricians, their mansions and their villas, all sorts of luxuries and land and rich furnishings and so on. Typically, a wealthy Roman would possess hundreds of garments. Horace, the poet, tells us that Lucullus celebrated, here's one who celebrated for sumptuous banquets. And on one occasion, he loaned to a theatrical agent 5,000 garments, which were used in a theatrical manner. And of course, people of Rome had maybe, if they were lucky, one garment. And one of the chief items of the assets of owners was, of course, chattels, slaves. A wealthy Roman often owned hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. There was the writer Pliny, who says that under the Emperor Augustus, a rich landlord whose name was Isidore Sicilius had around 4,100 slaves. So Jesus is very important here, of course, for the source of the church teachings. He doesn't condemn riches, right? He does proclaim their dangers and suggests proper uses, and we see a Christian vision of the advantages of proper use, right? This is well documented in papal documents that reference the case of the rich young man who comes to Jesus and says, "Good master, what work should I do that I would have life everlasting?" And Jesus says, "Keep the commandments." So we know that that's necessary for salvation. You don't have to give up your goods. Then the young man continues and insists and says, "I've kept the commandments. What is yet wanting of me?" And Jesus says, "If you are going to be perfect, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven. Come to follow me." So this notion of perfection is, yes, you keep the commandments, but you strip yourself of your goods. So this is not a universal precept, but a counsel. He wanted the apostles to abandon everything, of course, those who came nearest to him. But among the disciples, we find pious women who provided the band of Jesus' followers out of their means. That's in Luke 8, by the way. So you see there were fairly wealthy persons who were supporting the apostolic work. And he doesn't enjoin upon them absolute poverty. Lazarus of Bethany was actually quite rich, and Jesus called that man, Lazarus, a friend in John 11:11. Now there are dangers of wealth, right? Excessive wealth can be harmful. Yes, the rich young man, hearing what Jesus said, went away sad, for he had great possessions. And so Jesus turned to the disciples and said, "Amen, I say to you, a rich man shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven." See, riches make it difficult to enter for three basic reasons. It affords us comforts, and so we could forget God in heaven. Secondly, we basically derive many means of gratifying passions, and some of those passions are quite dangerous. And thirdly, the possessions can render persons proud or even covetous, and thus that makes us neglect grave duties that are imposed upon us all. St. Paul comments on the advantages of wealth, saying, quote, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing in the world, and certainly we carry nothing out. But having food and wherewith to be covered with all these, we are content. For they that will become rich can fall into temptation and into the snare of the evil one, and into many unprofitable, hurtful desires. These will drown men into destruction and perdition. For thus the desire of money is the root of evils, which some coveting has erred from the faith, and they entangle themselves in many sorrows." Right, this is 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 to 10. Sorry. Stick with the proper use now. Right, you see Jesus say, "With difficulty will a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven." Difficult doesn't mean impossible, so the rich man can be saved. The rich man indeed must be saved. To be saved, you have to have a proper use of your riches, and Jesus teaches us this. First, you should keep your heart detached from these earthly goods, to be poor in spirit. Perhaps you're not poor in fact, but thus be poor in spirit. This is Matthew 5:3, part of the Magna Carta of our life. Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon, which really means riches. He didn't say that you couldn't possess the wealth. Rather, you should not serve the wealth. Don't let it be your idol or your master. Don't let your conscience be sacrificed. Next, before God, you consider Him as the owner, and we are just simply tenants of the goods. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians in the first letter, verse 7 of the 4th chapter, says, "What do you have that you have not received?" See, God, who is absolute master of all, grants us access to the goods. So we should be good stewards, because we're going to give an account of our stewardship. Read Luke 16, verses 1 to 8. The parable of the unjust steward is there. Also, right, Christ wants us to give whatever is superfluous to us, give it to the poor. In Luke 3:11, we hear, "He who has 2 coats, let him give away one, that one who has none might have it. He that has meat, let him do it in like manner." And this is actually an absolute precept. For Luke 11:41 reads, "Give which remains as alms." So you should have enough that is necessary to support yourself and your family according to your social condition. Now that's the key phrase. Leo the 13th says, quote, "No one is obliged to distribute to others which is required for his own needs and those of his household, nor even to give away what is reasonably required to keep up one's condition in life. For one ought to live in a manner that is becoming. But when necessity and convenience are satisfied, it's our duty to give what is left over to the poor. It's not a duty of justice, except in cases of extreme necessity, but of Christian charity." End quote. That's Leo from Rerum Novarum. See, so we have the church giving us some practical pointers. Jesus says that there are advantages that come from proper use. There's a range of them. First, we hear the Lord say the right use of riches actually will open the kingdom of heaven to us. He says, "Come, blessed of my Father, you possess the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink," and so on. This is Matthew 25. Jesus, right, is identifying himself with the poor. In Luke 16, verse 9, we hear, "Make unto you friends of the mammon of iniquity, that when you should fail, they might receive you into the everlasting dwellings." So the idea there is that you find people in need and you try to uh, uh, provide for them out of your own wealth. And this is part of what is a dictate due to the ramifications in terms of opening the kingdom of God to us. Secondly, it merits for us the help and the blessings of God. In Luke 6, verse 38, Jesus says, "Given it will be given to you." So you'll receive in heaven, but also on earth. And in Proverbs 19:17, he who has mercy on the poor is lending to the Lord. See, and if you lend to the Lord, the interest rate, of course, is sky high. He'll give you back so much. The teachings of the church are pretty clear. It re-echoes what Christ has shown us. It's especially concerned, I think, in the documents you'll note, raise the issue of different classes, recognizing that social classes could never be eliminated, but rather greater inequalities can give way to lesser inequalities. And that's possible and a duty of Christians. There are two things of note. In the primitive church, the church held love feasts, agapes, they called them. And what happened is the faithful of the different social classes would mingle together their foods, and then they would eat at a common table. So there would have been a sharp contrast between one who had a lot and one who had very little, but now there isn't waste. There's somebody who might be suffering, who is actually being cared for in the love feast. And someone who suffers in the modern world, of course, might undergo an accentuated form of such suffering, given varied economic systems. That gives rise to the need of the distribution question, which follows, right, from the production question. The Corinthian church is what I highlighted there, that people were going into factions that roughly aligned to their social classes. And Paul condemned those Corinthian Christians for this. And Pius XII refers to his commemorating radio broadcast of Rerum Novarum, saying that right goods are created by God for all persons. And he says in that radio address, quote, "The economic wealth of a people does not properly consist of abundance of goods, but in the fair distribution of goods." So there's this nuance here of how we might measure wealth and assess the relative goodness of the company. How does it share the wealth it has created? Pius XII was very interested in an equitable distribution of goods. And this, of course, gives rise to the notion of international wealth and poverty as well, which you'll be able to read about. This comes up in several of the different documents. So that the notion of equity is raised to not just the level of the individual or persons within particular social classes, but the assessment of wealth distribution happens at a nation-state level, where if you allow for economic resources to be used, materials to be developed, wealth to be generated from legitimate transactions, the recognition of the church is that things that support and are legitimately meeting human needs are really destined for the use of all. It's tricky though, right? We see innovation being incentivized by perhaps one example, the ability to generate wealth as a result of doing something for a wide group of persons. Of course, now what we do have though is the Lord's teaching on the right use of those riches which we do acquire. Where primarily they're supposed to be offered for the relief of the poor. Now this doesn't mean purely the sort of modern version of charity, but it could be the use of wealth to create jobs, which also lift persons out of poverty. So examining poverty, we're going to deal with some definitions just to get that straightforward. We'll deal with the how to put it, the sort of gospel teaching on voluntary poverty. But we'll also consider these varied dimensions to help flesh out our understanding and the church's teaching on this topic, which is the primary subject of most of the papal documents in terms of the prioritization of the poor. I think the church is following the Lord's teaching, so you see it prominent in the gospel, of course. And we'll examine poverty in the pagan world. Christian experience shows us that Jesus provided a dignification of the poor. And we'll look at how the church also works in this area. Let me back up to definitions. And let's keep it straight. Okay, basically you have absolute and relative poverty, first kind. Absolute poverty being so destitute of temporal goods that your very life is in danger. This would be misery and beggary and indigence. But relative poverty is a condition where basically you have no superfluous goods. Maybe you only have what is strictly necessary for life. And so wages that basically are barely sufficient to support your family and yourself. Now, both types of poverty, both absolute and relative poverty, could be involuntary or voluntary. So an involuntary state would be one where basically conditions out of your control have brought about the status of poverty. Persons, of course, could accept such status in a kind of resigned manner. And of course, it's voluntary when you surrender your temporal goods in a sort of spontaneous way. And here we speak of religious persons that take a vow of poverty. They do this in order to try to cultivate gospel virtues and to obtain what's known as evangelical perfection. This, of course, is a condition that arises due to a counsel. It is not a precept. Christian poverty, isn't a state of perfection either, just merely a means of perfection. So the poor man might be perfect, a rich man might become perfect as well. It's us selecting different means. We also have effective and affective poverty. Be careful about, right? Effective poverty is just an actual lack of material goods, whereas affective refers to our detachment of heart from whatever we possess or do not possess. Now, the teachings of Christianity have always been that we have a duty to practice affective poverty. That's the necessary sort of condition to our perfection. Effective poverty could be recommended as a means, but not a necessary means. It might be a useful means. Now, having the state of absolute poverty is generally not advisable, right? It could lead to sin and debasement. Jesus, he exalted the weak, right? And raised up the oppressed. He was the redeemer of the poor, children, workers, marginalized persons. He also does a similar sort of elevation and exaltation of poverty. He grants it a kind of degree of dignity. And so to understand how that impacts the world, right, is to look at how the pagans thought of poverty. The poor basically were despised. It was considered a state of debasement and dishonor, of inferiority. There were exceptional cases, of course, but really riches were seen as desirable. What's fascinating too is, right, the gospel story in Luke 8:14 has the sower of the seeds, and that the riches of the world are considered as thorns, right, kind of choking up the good growth. So it's again a warning presented. Poverty is sometimes also kind of linked up with extravagance and haughtiness, in the sense that, right, poverty was so despised and ridiculed, say, Greek philosophers, for instance, thought of the poor as kind of like the equivalent of the dogs. And some of those, the cynics, actually decided to embrace such poverty. Diogenes would say, I carry all my belongings with me, omnia me mecum porto. But generally, the poor man is despised and thus forgotten. Pity and kindliness was really unknown towards the poor. Right? There were no shelters, hospitals for the poor, no almshouses. There were great numbers of slaves, and basically a kind of social plague of pauperism existed. There were, of course, the many who were poor, the very, very few who had immense wealth. And of course, the injunctions about unauthorized transfers of wealth, which would lead to great injustices in society, were adopted by the church. This was a time when there was a fixed level of wealth. And in fact, you have a kind of disposition of caution about wealth acquisition. But Jesus dignifies poverty. It's like a reversal of values takes place. Kind of caught up in the same theme as the exaltation of the weak and the marginalized. Poverty's made honorable, right? It's kind of given a sacred character. So that, for instance, St. Francis decides to become poor, in fact, calls poverty his lady, kind of bringing the notion of Christian poverty into the medieval sort of bardic approach to the lady. Jesus dignifies poverty by his example, right? He's heralded King of Israel, but he's born in a stable. He lives in a little home. He's a working man in Nazareth. In fact, when he comes to his public ministry, people say, hey, I'll follow you. And Jesus says, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And the great poverty of Jesus is especially exemplified at Calvary. He is stripped of all his possessions, and the soldiers cast lots. We learn about poverty by his teachings. Right? Jesus practiced poverty and he also preached it. He exalted the poor, but he himself identifies himself right with the poor. In the Old Testament, Christ would be heralded as the liberator of the poor. Psalm 71 says he will deliver the poor from the mighty. In Luke 4:18, when asked who he was, he says, tell them that the gospel has been preached to the poor. And the opening words of the Sermon on the Mount are, blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so immediately we see the phrase poor in spirit referring to affective poverty, part of the charter of the Christian life. And then he confirms this doctrine. And this is sort of strange to worldly ears. In Luke 16, verses 19 to 22. Quote, there was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen. To be clothed in purple is a sign of great wealth. The Phoenicians, also known as the Canaanites, were the source of purple dyes, which were primarily utilized by nobility. So this man was feasting sumptuously every day, and there was a certain poor beggar named Lazarus who lay at his gate, full of sores, desiring to be filled with crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. The dogs came and licked his sores. It came to pass the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And the rich man died, and he was buried in hell. So that's quite a reversal from, say, the pagan vision of wealth. He wasn't really satisfied with exalting the poor. He commanded that the poor be relieved. He said, give what remains in alms in Luke 11. And remember, the rich young man says, what should I do? And Jesus says, give your stuff to the poor. And Zacchaeus was the host of Jesus. And Zacchaeus was a publican. And after he met Jesus and was converted, says, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have wronged any man of anything, that is, obtained riches unjustly, I will restore it fourfold. He identifies himself with the poor as well. On the day of the last judgment, the dignity of the poor is raised to a fairly crucial platform, for he says, I say to you, as long as you did it to one of my least brethren, right, to the most poor, you did it to me. That's thus a condition of a final judgment. The church exalts the poor, following her lesson from Christ. She would show a kind of a predilection during the pagan age to rescuing the poor, especially the slaves. Onesimus is a slave of Philemon. Philemon's a wealthy Christian at Colossus, and the slave had run away to avoid punishment. He made it to Rome and found St. Paul, who was in prison. See, then St. Paul converted Onesimus, baptized him, and sent him back to the master. And Paul writes, I plead with you for my own son, whom I have begotten in prison, for Onesimus. Receive him no longer as a slave, but as a brother most dear. Welcome as you would welcome me. And if he did you any injury or owes you anything, charge it to me. See, the Christian master, St. Paul, unbounds the slave, makes him a brother and a dear brother. The church helps the poor, too. The thinker Bossuet put it well when he said that the poor were the firstborn and the authentic ones of the church. So this care actually begins right away. The apostles, devoting themselves to religious functions, would bring charity and relief into the midst of the church. And at first they're doing it personally, but then the College of Deacons is commissioned to serve at the tables and to distribute to the poor and the widows. We hear in Acts 4, this quote from Luke, so Acts 4, 32 to 35, the multitude of believers had but one heart and one soul. Neither was anyone needy among them, for many were owners of lands or houses, and they sold these. They brought the price of the things they sold and laid it before the feet of the apostles, and distribution was made to all according to the need. Remember that this has echoes, hints of communism, which, of course, here are rooted in radical conversion and voluntary delivery of our goods for others. And this is, of course, the primary core principle of all of these teachings throughout this course. That is our conversion, right, our encounter with Christ that begins to lay a groundwork for our ability to judge anew and to act in light of this encounter with Christ. Paul, we also know, was engaged in a wide range of apostolic missions, and he would collect alms for the poor. We know that the church has given birth to a wide variety of charitable institutions, almshouses and age shelters, handicap institutions. We have services for the blind and the deaf, hospitals. Those who are poor intellectually would be served in Christian schools and universities. It's always been the teaching of the church and the mind of the church to engage in this form of charity and relief for the poor. It's the contribution of self, though, and the discovery of self that you'll see highlighted especially in papal documents. Pius XII says, quote, the great temptation of an age that calls itself social, in which, besides the church, the state, the cities, and other public bodies attend to social problems, the great temptation of this age is that persons among the faithful, perhaps, when the poor man knocks at the door, simply sends him to the department, to the office, to the organization, figuring that their own personal obligation is sufficiently satisfied by these institutions. Going on, the Pope says, no doubt the needy person would then receive your help in any other way, but often he counts on you, on a word of kindness, perhaps, or comfort from you. Your charity would resemble God's. And this would be part of the gospel, right? for God came in person to bring us help. One of the more famous institutions that sprang from this lived experience of the church is the work of St. Vincent de Paul, the society, or the conferences is what this is called. This society was founded in Paris in 1893 by Frederick Ozanam. He was receiving Holy Communion and he would go visiting the poor, and he would say, I'm going to return from my visit to Jesus, but then wind up visiting Jesus again in the poor. If you look at the 2,000-year tradition of Christian charity toward the poor, you would see that the opinion of the world has dramatically changed. The poor is no longer despised, but rather the poor person has right dignity and nobility. It kind of transfuses into broader social frameworks and informs political organization. So the Vatican documents this time around are collected together in one single document. It's 30 pages long. Go to Blackboard, and I have some queries there for you on this topic in the discussion board. I was thinking I'd put some excerpts in place too, but not necessary, I don't think. And you have the journal where I have a couple of questions that I'm going to put in place to try to provoke you to respond in light of what you've read and heard. For now, though, all is done, and I'll put this one up. Hope you all have a great week. God bless.